So welcome to this conference session that addresses a general theme of human rights in times of crisis, learning from the past in the future with a question mark. So my name is Kathy Liebal and I direct UConn's Human Rights Institute. And I want to thank the co-directors and the team that organized today's virtual conference. It's going very well. Thank you especially for the people handling the technology. And I express my enormous gratitude to Minister Teresa Bauer, Consul General Nicole Meisenbach, as well as President Kriegelstein and Vice President Dan Wiener, as well as Assistant Vice President Yu-Hong Rong, for their ongoing and substantive support of the initiative. We wish we were there in person as had been planned, but this is about as close as you can get to a wonderful conference virtually. So the panel will address Holocaust and Genocide education at a critical juncture. And the focus of the panel today has been generated through the activities of the Faculty Research Working Group on Human Rights Education and Solidarity, which is comprised of nearly 20 faculty members from a number of different universities and colleges in the consortium on both sides of the Atlantic. Today's session, as it has been noted for the conference in general, coincides with the commemoration of Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. This is something the U.S. Holocaust Museum has framed as historically figuring as an essential turning point in Nazi Germany's persecution of Jews. We have an opportunity today to think about how memory of and learning from the past may shape our future. Our panelists, Avinoam, Patt, Mitoma, and Karin Amos, have devoted their careers to developing, implementing, and evaluating educational programs on Holocaust and genocide studies in both the United States and Germany. And so I'll briefly introduce the speakers who Avi and Glenn will present for about 15 minutes, followed by a 5-minute response and comments by Karin Amos. And then we will have about, we hope, 10 minutes for discussion. Please do put your name, don't just say I have a question, but put your name in the chat button. And then if we look like we're running short on time, feel free to pose the question in the chat so that the speakers can look at those later. If you ask a question, please keep your comments very brief to allow time for several exchanges. So Avinoam Patt is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. He's a member of HRI's Faculty Advisory Committee, and he's a welcome member of our working group. He is the author and editor of several volumes on Jewish displaced persons in post-war Germany, and most recently completed a new book on the early post-war memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and is co-editor of the new volume, Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust. Glenn Mitoma is Assistant Professor of Human Rights and Education and Director of Dodd Human Rights Impact at the University of Connecticut, which is a very important public outreach and engagement arm of the Human Rights Institute. He is the author, editor of articles and collections focused on the history of human rights and human rights education, as well as the monograph, Human Rights and the Negotiation of American Power. As Dodd Impact Director, he oversees a range of outreach and engagement programs designed to foster a culture of human rights at the university in Connecticut and around the world. And Karin Amos is Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University of Tübingen. She is also Professor of General Education at Tübingen and is focused on education and society, international education governance, education, and examining difference and diversity in her scholarship and her teaching. She is co-facilitator of the Faculty Research Group on Human Rights, Education, and Solidarity, along with Dorothy Weichbrecht, and I thank her very much for her co-facilitation work. So I believe that Avi is going to control the slides for the first presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you to the organizers for the incredible work. I'm going to share my screen, and Glenn is going to start our presentation, and we'll do a little choreography between the two of us. So Glenn, I'm going to share the slideshow and go right ahead.
Great. All right. Thanks, Avi. And thanks, of course, to Kathy and all the organizers for putting this on. We're upping the degree of difficulty. We're going to go back and forth between Avi and I in this presentation, And we appreciate this opportunity in particular because we don't have something as full-fleshed as a paper draft or a full-blown project, but we have been working both together and separately on this question of Holocaust and genocide education within the state of Connecticut. So this has provided us a great opportunity to think through some of these dimensions. So the question put to us is, what impact education has in addressing the current crises? And Avi, you can go forward to the next slide. And of course, when we think about the crises, I've been saying, really, we've been talking about a kind of Russian nesting doll of crises nested within crises. Right in front of us at the kind of most intimate level, of course, we're all grappling with this question of the COVID-19 coronavirus crisis and the transformation of our daily and institutional and political lives that it has wrought. That, of course, is nested within a broader context of a rising trend of racism, anti-Semitism, and associated protests that have emerged both locally here in the United States and globally to demand accountability in those frames. That's occurring, as we all know, within a context of a democratic retreat and rising authoritarianism. And while there might be a modest blow struck for democracy this past week, we know that it is only modest in comparison to the broader trends which have seen authoritarians taking power across the globe and authoritarian tendencies, even in democracies, rising in many fashions. That too should be contextualized with a longer term, decades-long trend that has seen the extreme gap between rich and poor, both at national and international levels, achieving proportions we haven't seen since the heights of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And that, of course, all of this then culminates in the last click, a climate crisis, which poses an existential threat to everyone on the planet, and in which all of these other crises are, of course, related and intertwined. So these are, of course, really big questions and concerns, and it's a lot to ask education, even in its broadest sense, to play a significant role in addressing them. Nevertheless, we think there is an important role to play. And what we wanted to do today is share with you a kind of very narrow picture and to think through what some of those dimensions are by focusing specifically on education about the Holocaust and genocide, and in a particular location, the state of Connecticut, which has some recent developments in this particular field. So what we're going to do is we're going to share a little bit on the background for the Connecticut, what we refer to as the Connecticut Mandate on genocide and Holocaust education. We're going to talk about some challenges that we've identified in the implementation of that mandate, and then we're going to pivot to some opportunities for impact in implementing that mandate that align with broader human rights education approaches that I think then will broaden out into perhaps some identifying some opportunities on these larger crises that we face. So Avi's going to start us out. He's going to kick it back to me, and then I'm going to kick it back to him for a conclusion. And we're all going to stay within our 10-minute time frame. So Avi, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Glenn. And once again, thank you again to the organizers and to Kathy for this opportunity. As Glenn suggested, one of our goals here in this presentation is to think about very specifically the Holocaust and genocide education efforts that have taken place here in Connecticut, but also to think about as Sebastian suggested, the beginning of a conversation for us to think about what is successful, what has been unsuccessful in Holocaust and genocide, and more broadly human rights education, both here in Connecticut and in Baden-Württemberg. As you see here on the slide, as Glenn mentioned, the state of Connecticut in 2018 mandated Holocaust and genocide education, meaning that it was required in public education efforts as part of state social studies standards. And now, according to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., this makes Connecticut one of 14 states in the United States that require Holocaust and genocide education. And Glenn and I, in our different positions over time, have been very involved in efforts both to get the legislation passed here in the state of Connecticut, but also to provide resources for teachers that unfortunately are sorely lacking in terms of how to do this well. And part of this has to do with the context of how this legislation was passed in the state of Connecticut. I should also note that before moving to Connecticut, I used to work at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. as a historian in the Research Institute there. And so I've seen these efforts both on the federal level in terms of what centralized efforts coming out of Washington, D.C., and now here very specifically on the state level. And one thing that this points out, and one of the challenges that we'd like to discuss with you, is the limits of sort of Holocaust and genocide education efforts and Holocaust and genocide education mandates on different state levels. Some of you might be familiar with a recent survey that was put out by the Claims Conference, the Conference on Material Claims. Recently, this came out in September of 2020, which surprisingly or unsurprisingly, we can discuss this, found that in many cases, these mandates perhaps have not been very successful in instilling a sort of deeper historical knowledge in some of the basic facts of the Holocaust. Now, we've discussed this. This might also be a reflection of sort of a gap in general historical knowledge in general that has focused specifically on the history of the Holocaust. But as the Claims Conference conducted a survey of levels of Holocaust knowledge among millennials and Generation Z across 50 states, they found sort of concerning findings about all sorts of basic levels of knowledge about the history of the Holocaust, including sort of state level knowledge about how many students in this category of millennials, Gen Z, that actually knew that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And you can see these percentages across the country, pretty consistent, around 60% in different states did not know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Now, one of the interesting things for us to discuss is that there is basically no correlation between states that have a mandate that require Holocaust or Holocaust and genocide education and levels of knowledge. So states like California and Florida and Illinois and Connecticut and New York and New Jersey, which all require Holocaust education, had a similar lack of knowledge among their students as states which do not require it. And there's other findings that they found in the survey. I'm going to zoom through, pun intended, zoom through sort of different levels of the lack of knowledge, not being able to name names of concentration camps or ghettos, not being able to identify Auschwitz-Birkenau, not knowing this fact about how many Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. What I will say is especially troubling about this, and to push back on the findings of the survey a little bit, one of our concerns with this data is that it doesn't reflect significant differences that take place also within states. So Glenn and I have worked very closely with teachers in the state of Connecticut who are incredibly dedicated to Holocaust and genocide education, who would push back on this and say there's no way that their students would come out of their schools without this knowledge. So there's significant variability depending on how dedicated different teachers are to teaching about this. One of the number one concerns about the present moment that we're living in is that a lot of students report seeing Holocaust denial and distortion on social media. The Claims Conference survey focused on Holocaust knowledge. I think we can broaden this out to all sorts of other genocides as well, where we see just a rampant sort of, for lack of a better term, fake news, distortion, lack of validated information that circulates all over online, where a lot of millennials, Gen Z get their information. And so this is extremely concerning. This also points to the degree to what teachers are up against when teaching about this. At the same time, a bright spot is that there is a great deal of interest in learning about this history and a recognition of its importance. So with that context, I'll just note that in the state of Connecticut, we passed this law in the year 2018 to mandate Holocaust and genocide education on the state level in social studies frameworks. Some of the reasons for mandating the passage of this law, I have to admit, it was helpful, the current political moment that we were living in the United States, seeing concerning rising levels of anti-Semitism, of racism, of all kinds, gave us the political winds to pass this legislation. There was also recognition that this type of education could be helpful. Students could learn about the past. Students could become better citizens of the countries in which they were living. Students could play an important role in genocide prevention work. And students could also engage in commemorative work, right? Preserving the memory of those groups, both who were the targets of genocide, but also learning to value distinctiveness and learning to value those cultures and those civilizations. Before I pass it on to Glenn, I will just say that some of the challenges in the passage of this legislation was the fact that, yes, we had the political forces to pass legislation, as long as it would not cost the state any additional funding. And so this is very frequent. What often happens is that there is a reliance on higher education, on private groups to fill the gap. So you have a mandate without state support for teachers, resources for teachers. And one of the things that happens is there's a great deal of variability in terms of how this is taught. We have great concerns about that sort of using the Holocaust or using genocide to teach simplistic moral lessons without sort of deeper examination and knowledge of the complicated history that's involved, or tendencies to teach about rescue, looking for the silver lining, or anti-bullying, sort of using it to teach those sorts of things. And many schools simply do not have enough time. They have mandates to teach all sorts of things without enough time to teach this. I'm going to pass it back over to Glenn to just wrap up some of the challenges that we see in implementation.
Right. Thanks, Avi. And I just want to give a couple. I have a joint appointment with our School of Education, so I think about this a lot in an education context. And it's important in Connecticut to note three particular items that impinge this ability to implement. One is that similar to much of the United States, education is incredibly localized in Connecticut. There is very loose and limited centralized control, almost none from the national level and very little from the state. And so we have 169 towns each who sent their own educational agenda, and that's a challenge for implementing something like this. Second is a general trend within the United States, and that is towards standardized accountability measures. This is things like testing, surveillance of teachers, and tying both of those things to funding allocations. So it ratchets up the incentives to focus on, say, reading and math, the things that are tested as a measure of school effectiveness. And then the last thing I'll note is that that Connecticut in general is one of the most racially and economically segregated places in the country. And it's one that in particular affects our education system. So within Connecticut, you have some of the best public schools in the world, frankly, as well as some of the worst anywhere. And this context is incredibly difficult to work with for a variety of issues, including this one. Let me pivot quickly, and I know we're running out of time to the opportunities, and I think the opportunities here can be summed up in the idea of human rights education. Oftentimes I do this survey with people I do workshops with, ask them why they should teach genocide, why is it important, and at the top of the list are the practical purposes. Combat, you see this is a kind of one from a recent event. At the top are combat recent upsurge in racism and hate, and promote human rights and democratic citizenship. So you can see there's a clarity of purpose among educators about why this is important. Go ahead to the next slide, Avi. And that means I think it opens up an opportunity to approach genocide and Holocaust education through the human rights education lens. And this is a framework developed over the past 40 years, articulated well by the 2011 UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, and essentially summarized by the notion of about, for, and through. Right, that HRE is education about human rights. So here we would focus on knowledge about the Holocaust and genocide that really allows for an understanding of the cross-cutting nature of genocide as emblematic of a series of crises, much similar to what we're living through now. But it's oriented toward useful knowledge that's just not there in the abstract to memorize facts and figures, but that is part of an overall objective encapsulated by the second two, right? Education for human rights, about the purpose of the education that you're receiving. And in this case, it's about real world skills and about underlying values. that promote students' ability to push back against genocidal tendencies. And finally, this notion of education through human rights, that the educational process itself must be one that reinforces the human rights of all stakeholders. Those include the students, but also the educators, the families, the communities as a whole. Taken together through an HRE framework, we think there's an opportunity to do genocide and Holocaust education that is, at the end of the day, fundamentally and basically anti-genocidal. And that's where we see some opportunities. So I'll leave it there for Avi to give any final concluding thoughts, and then we'll kick it over to Karin.
It's been a perfect summary, so I'm happy to turn it over to Karin Amos now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this thought-provoking, highly illuminating presentation. And in fact, I think we could take it from here and spend the entire day discussing it. And there was so much in it that really resonates with what we are also struggling with in Baden-Württemberg. Maybe to take up on one of the things that that Avi was saying, you know, the kind of skills-oriented, future-proof teaching. And there is also a backside to this. And in fact, there is some criticism in Germany saying that if we define Holocaust education too narrowly or too much oriented in addressing current day issues, we are missing the point. So we need to find ways, and I think Anna Baranike Rothstein, who is also with us today, could tell us a lot about how to improve the pedagogics of Holocaust education, because I think that sometimes we are not really reaching the students, not because of bad intentions or because teachers are not knowledgeable, but because we do it in ways that do not address the mindsets of the young generation. But I'm not sure, you know, whether a too competency-oriented framework is really the answer here, you know. And I'm thinking about what the members of the Frankfurt School of Sociology were saying, Horkheimer and Adorno, about the problems with, you know, Nazi Germanism was that lack, you know, that utter absence of human compassion. And this is something so fundamental that it's, you know, a much deeper and broader issue than any skills-based approach. But maybe this just as an aside. I was very much taken by your presentation, and I took this as an opportunity to look a little bit into how Holocaust education, what the current state of Holocaust education in Germany is. And I was seeing some of the same puzzling findings that you've been addressing for the United States. Now, of course, in Germany, Holocaust education has been compulsory for many decades, and it is done so through a common agreement of the education secretaries who meet in a standing conference. So although Germany has also a federal system of education, there is some basic agreement on organizational and content issues by this standing conference. And so they've been in a very long debate on Holocaust education, and they've been implemented it, or made sure that it's implemented in the 16 Länder by now after reunification, and made mandatory. And it is usually taught in the context of either history or civic education, kind of social studies, as you were mentioning, in grade 9 and 10, sometimes even in grade 8. And then again, for the more advanced students who are in the upper level of their secondary education at grade 11 or 12. But by then, you know, a substantial portion of the young generation is no longer in that formal education system. And what was surprising, you know, I mean, like I said, there were many initiatives. There is an agreement to collaborate with Yad Vashem. You know, this was signed in 2013 to increase all efforts of working together and draw all institutions into this common work. There is also the membership of Germany of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and Germany reported in 2012. So it is really deeply embedded in a number of important networks. But nevertheless, in 2018, there was a report by the Wissenschaftliche Dienst, the scientific service, reporting to the German Federal Parliament. And the theme of this report was, how is Nazism, the history of Nazism taught in Germany? But it was also, of course, in that context, addressing the issue of Holocaust education. And what was surprising is that according to a representative survey, only 59% of the students older than 14, but younger than 17, knew that Auschwitz-Birkenau was a concentration and extermination camp. And so you're wondering, how can that be? If for all students, Holocaust education is compulsory, so how do we find a significant number of German students not able to address it? The older students, 17 and older, reported, or 71% of the 17 and older reported they knew what it was. But we are talking about an age group. This is kind of outside, of the mandatory education framework, which is at a younger age, at grades 9 or 10 at the latest. So, I think there is a lot to discuss and a lot to, immerse ourselves in. Baden-Württemberg still places a huge emphasis on teaching history, and it's doing that in the framework of saying you don't know, you can't really shape the future if you don't know about the past. So it's not teaching about the past for its own sake, but knowing where we're coming from is essential in knowing where we're going. So they're taking a very problem-based, competency-based approach. And much of this, I think, is very, very good and can be built on. But I'm sure that if we dig deeper, we'll also find some issues and some problems. So I'm looking very much forward to further collaborations. And I thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Thank you.